On this November episode of Unanswered Questions, we're doing something a bit different. Instead of focusing on a movie or a series of movies, we're talking about vampire lore and how it's portrayed in movies. I've got a bunch of questions, some of them from my patrons, and I'm going to show a bunch of examples from vampire movies to illustrate my answers. And the challenge is, can you identify them all?
One question.
How exactly does one become a vampire?
Throughout history, there's been bunches of different explanations and ways to be turned, but there's one thing that remains fairly constant, and that's being bitten. In most vampire films, it's the simple act of being bitten by a vampire that makes you one of them. There's some popular culture depictions like the Buffy the Vampire Slayer show, in which it goes further than that. There, not only does a vampire have to bite you, but then you must also then drink their blood to be turned. If you're simply bitten, it's just that. It's a bite. The Dusk Till Dawn vampires are the polar opposite of this, as in that film, the most casual of nibble will cause you to turn. Again, depending on the film, the amount of time seems to vary as well as the general rules. In Fright Night, the process seems to take a while, and you can be reverted back to human if you kill the sire vampire before the sun comes up. In other films, like the 1931 Dracula, it takes a day or two after being bitten to rise. But again, in Dusk Till Dawn, or even 30 Days of Night, it's almost instantaneous. If you take away the bite, the blood exchange aspect still seems to be important. Take Lost Boys, for example, in which Michael is turned by simply drinking vampire blood from a bottle. No puncture required. Oddly enough, in folklore, there are other ways to become a vampire that don't involve any toothy contact. In Slavic legend, you just have to be an asshole and you can become a vampire when you die. Or if your death isn't natural, like a suicide. You can also become one if an animal either jumps over your corpse or your empty grave. And there's even cases that state that a bird flew over the corpse, which, I mean, that kind of sounds like it would happen a lot. There's like tons of birds. But let's also not forget the Jiangshi, also known as the Chinese hopping vampires. One of the ways that they become undead is by not burying the person after the funeral is held. If that happens, lightning will strike the body and bring it back to life. And I can kind of get behind that one because,
Come on, time management, people.
Two questions.
Your friendly neighborhood Uncle Pete is confused, though. Is it transferred by a bite? And how does that work?
Again, I'm sure this varies from depiction to depiction, but it's never really conveyed exactly how the whole infection thing happens. But there's really only a couple of ways that this whole thing happens. One is that it's completely supernatural and more of a curse than an actual scientific process. As soon as the criteria of the spell or curse or whatever are met, then the change occurs. If the standards are just a bite, then that's when it happens. Nothing else matters. But if it's not just straight up magical, then there's some methodology to it. The most likely is that the vampires have a venom within their fangs, much like a snake does. And when they sink in their teeth, that venom is released. There's probably some sort of endorphin effect thing, which is why you always see people kind of moaning and all chill while some dude chomps on their veins. But there's also some sort of virulent substance passed through, like a virus or DNA or what have you, that intermixes with the humans and turns them. Three questions.
Why do crosses affect them?
It should probably be noted that vampires aren't just scared of crosses, but any religious iconography, which is pretty wild when you think about it, and I'll talk about why in a minute. But the implication is that vampires are undead and agents of evil, or Satan, and anything on the opposite end of that spectrum will affect them if it is considered holy. Now, again, this changes from story to story. Like in Love at First Bite, we see that the Star of David has no effect, whereas a cross does. But in Marvel Comics' version of Dracula, it does work. The general thought is that it ultimately doesn't matter what the symbol is as much as the belief and faith of the holder. As stated in Fright Night pretty blatantly, if the person with the symbol doesn't really believe in it, then it won't work. Using this whole philosophy, you could kind of imply that just about anything will work. In the old Hammer movies, it's like any two things you can hold together can be a cross, as long as you believe that it will work. In From Dusk Till Dawn, Harvey Keitel uses a shotgun as part of a cross, and it works because he believes that it will. I mean, hell, in Doctor Who, they say that faith and belief in anything works, with a Russian soldier warding them off with the hammer and sickle. Salem's Lot works like this too, with faith being essential to using the cross, and the strange implication of this is really what counts as faith. Does it have to be some higher being, or can it be a strong belief in something like that Russian soldier? If you're just like super into Pokemon, would holding up a Pikachu work? Because that would be kind of awesome. Keep in mind though that there are instances in which crosses and religious stuff just doesn't work, like on True Blood, in which crosses are referred to as just geometry, and Interview with a Vampire as well, so this is not a constant. Weirdly, in the recent BBC Dracula, Zoe Helsing states that vampires are so afraid of crosses because they're afraid of death and have a shame in being cursed to live forever, which I'm not sure how translates into someone holding up a cross and you backing away from it, but whatever. Ultimately, though, I suppose it couldn't hurt to try if you just find yourself cornered. Just make sure that whatever you have, you believe in one hell of a lot.
Get back.
4 questions. Ha ha ha.
What about wooden stakes? What's that all about?
So here's the thing, wooden stakes through the heart have a reputation in films as being the primary way to kill a vampire. Certain franchises like Buffy revel in the notion of it, although others, like Blade, simply have it as one of a myriad of ways to take them out. And that seems to be the more historically sound. It wasn't really done as a way of killing vampires. In fact, in ancient lore, the stakes had a different purpose. If you were concerned that someone that died was going to rise again as a member of the undead, when they were buried, a wooden stake was driven through them and into the ground, preventing them from being able to. There's evidence of this actually being done in our non-fictional world, although most of the wooden variety have wasted away to time, but there are metal ones still showing evidence of the practice. Over time, the practice was modified to be the killing blow, although it should be noted that in the original Stoker Dracula novel, it was not a stake that killed him, but a metal Bowie knife. In film, though, he definitely gets wood.
I should probably rephrase that.
Now, in most movies, it's any old stake that'll work, and you can make them out of pretty much anything, including pencils. But in folklore, the type of wood that's used is essential to the process. Depending upon the mythologies of different religions, it might have to be ash, aspen, willow, or juniper, and it looks like white oak is actually the preferred choice of Van Helsing. In tying in the religious iconography stuff, aspen is said to be the wood that the crucifixion cross was made from, so that factors in there too. Movies like to play with this, and the most interesting addition to the whole thing is the concept that when you stake a vampire, they burn up into nothing. And this didn't happen in older film versions. In fact, one of the dangers to look out for was removing a stake from a vampire's corpse. If you do that, the sucker comes right back to life. So I guess if you killed a vampire this way, you'd just have to leave it there, untouched for like ever. So I guess the more modern notion of dusting a vampire is a hell of a lot tidier in the long run, even if you have to shop back up a ton of remains. 5 questions.
My friend Victor from the horror movie Syllabus wants to know about mirrors and how that whole refraction thing really works.
I mean, isn't that defying the laws of physics?
Well, yeah, it really is. There's no rational way to make it work.
Now, there's actually several reasons given for exactly why this happens, and I think that they're all flawed for the same reason. The first reason given is the most common, and that's that most older mirrors were backed with silver, which is a pure metal. Since vampires are considered evil and impure for some reason, they counter the purity of the silver and it won't reflect them, which is how it is in Stoker's Dracula. The second reason given is that mirrors reflect the soul, and since vampires have none, they don't show up. And the third is that for some reason, light passes through vampires instead of bouncing off of them, and because mirrors are reflected light, they don't show up. Most of these reasons don't add up for basically the same thing.
Freaking clothes.
Sure, vampires don't have souls, but neither do my denims, so why do they reflect? I mean, nothing I'm wearing has a soul, so every time I look in the mirror, I should be naked, and I can think of nothing more horrifying. That applies to the silver backing thing too, because does that mean that when movies show a vampire not reflecting, that their choice in wardrobe is impure as well? I mean, I could see that because some of their sartorial tastes are pretty offensive, but going by that, when someone sees a vampire in the mirror, it should just be empty clothing standing there, not the air. It's just as so for the light passing through them thing too, because light passes through clothing, which is why I'm careful about my panty lines. But more than that, if light goes through them and doesn't bounce off of them so they don't show up on mirrors, the same should be for our eyes. Our eyes are just gooey mirrors, really. One of the times that this has actually been depicted is in the show Being Human, where it's only the vampires being reflected, and if they are naked and wet, it's just a reflection of the shape of water. Daybreakers works like this as well, since their clothes are reflected, and the same thing happens in Tales from the Hood 2. In the Interview with a Vampire series, vampires can see their reflections, as she felt that the notion was down to theology, and she didn't want her vampires set in a world of religious definites. Quick note that this also seems to extend to photos, since photography used to use silver in the film, and cameras utilize mirrors, but between the fact that silver is no longer used and mirrors aren't used in modern digital photography, this shouldn't really work either. I guess the whole soul thing can kind of apply, but not to digital cameras, since plenty of those don't actually use mirrors. 6 questions.
But hey, what about sunlight? Sarah Jenkins wants to know why that affects them. Why am I a bat again? Why am I a bat?
The biggest weakness that vampires have is sunlight. They're more volatile than a mogwai when it comes to that, and it's important to know that it wasn't always that way. In the original Dracula novel, although the Count avoided daylight, it wasn't all the time. He actually makes several appearances in the sun, and interestingly enough, the actual first instance of showing a vampire being vulnerable to morning beams is in 1922's Nosferatu. In folklore, even though vampires only appeared at night, there wasn't any stories of vampires being killed by the day. It was more just a general spooky creatures like the nighttime kind of a thing. So after Nosy basically added that little bit into the lore, it was adapted into the understood weaknesses of the monsters. Different films have again interpreted this in different ways. For instance, the Blade movies specify that it's the ultraviolet that harms them, introducing other tools like UV grenades and lamps that burn them. The Underworld series actually has UV bullets. Outside of little quirks though, it's the one aspect of the lore that's pretty consistent. There's not a ton of variation to the rules of it, and it's pretty frequently used as the big final kill method for the big bad, like in Dusk Till Dawn. Fright Night, both versions, and like a million others. There are, of course, examples that aren't affected by the light, like George Romero's Martin, who, let's face it, may or may not actually be a vampire. Blade is rather infamously a daywalker, not hindered by light, along with Selene from Underworld, and the vamps in Byzantium are immune as well. And interesting to note that in the 92 version of Bram Stoker's Dracula, like the book it's based on, Count Zorg can walk in the sun. but Van Helsing implies that other vampires would not be able to, and that Dracula is special. It's become a minor trope with suckers lathering on like SPF 5000 sunscreen to get around, like Deacon Frost in Blade, and Catherine in Bordello of Blood. And of course, I kind of told myself I wouldn't bring this up, but what the hell? Some vampires sparkle in the sun because their skin is like crystals or something. I'm not really going to get that deep into researching that. 7 questions.
Ryan Hill from Hill House Productions asked about whether vampires can have children.
As usual, the answer is dependent upon what form of media we're looking at, but there's actually a folklore answer to it, and that's that vampires can't become pregnant, but they can impregnate. Because their bodies are not actually alive, their bodies cannot sustain life. Although, according to a few tales, for some reason, female vampires can become pregnant, but only from a human male. Either way it happens, if there's a child born from either a vamp father or vamp mother from a human male, the offspring is referred to as a dhampir, and is only partially human and vampire. They're a little closer to human than undead, but do have extra senses and some additional abilities. Dhampirs can have kids much like any other human, but their children will have a 50% chance of being human and 50% chance of being another dhampir. With this in mind, more recent vampire tales have kind of tossed aside the whole notion of dead bodies and moved towards more of a viral take on vampires, and in this way their bodies still work and are able to support life. Now, in certain films, like Blade, vamps can just have kids. In fact, in those movies, there's actually a social caste for pure bloods, those who were born vampires, versus turnbloods, those made vampires. Well, you might ask, if you're born a vampire and you're immortal, wouldn't you just stay a baby forever? And the answer is, apparently not. Instead, they just age really slowly, although in some mythologies, like the young adult novels The Pure Blood Legacies, they are actually fully human until their early 20s, at which time the vampiric gene kicks in and they evolve into a full child of the night. 8 questions.
Stephen Bell wants to know, did Bram Stoker model Dracula after Vlad the Impaler?
So everyone knows that, right? Vlad Tepes was who Stoker based the blood-drinking count on. Right? Well, maybe not. Although it's pretty clear that he did indeed get the name of Vlad from here, it appears that that may be about it. Bram's son claimed that his father came up with the idea after a dream caused by eating too much dressed crab, and with the discovery of his working notes back in 1972, it seems that there's some good information showing it to be an untrue claim. Elizabeth Miller has a book about it entitled Dracula, Sense and Nonsense, that lays the time frame out and basically tears apart the notion of an impaler link, breaking down all the similarities bit by bit and finds no real link between the two. And the truth is that there really isn't any evidence, surely in the writer's notes, that connect them. There is also extensive lore and tales of vampires in there as well, so it's clear that he took some inspiration from existing folklore, but if he did draw inspiration for his book from the actual real-life Vlad the Impaler, he didn't write about it anywhere. So that doesn't rule out the possibility that he did get inspiration from Tepes, but it does make it kind of unlikely. 9 questions.
What's the link between vampire and the Exorcist?
I mean, it seems like there shouldn't be one, right? Well, believe it or not, there is. You see, no one really knows how far back the vampire legends go, but the legends reach at least to ancient Mesopotamia. They had this demon goddess named Lamastu who would prey on humans. She would creep into houses at night, killing babies, while also preying on adults by drinking their blood. Her origins were closely intertwined with the Jewish legends of Lilith, who is often considered to be the mother of all vampires, with scholars believing that the legend of Lilith being lifted directly from those of Lamashtu, considering the similarities in appearance as well as methods. So what about the ties to the Exorcist? Well, according to the stories, Lamashtu was once defeated by her greatest enemy, another evil god, one named Pazuzu. In order to protect themselves from Lamashtu, pregnant women, instead of wearing a cross to ward off vampires, because, ancient Mesopotamia, crosses and Jesus not really a thing yet, so instead of those, they wore pendants featuring the image of Pazuzu to ward her off. So the next time that you're watching those priests exorcise little Regan, just know that there might be vampires watching as well, and they're cheering them on like twice as loud. 10 questions.
My friend Jeremy told me that I couldn't do this list without asking. What about the Count?
Tons of vampires are counts, and when I asked that question, there should have been one guy that popped into your head. Count Von Count, the most notorious vampire of all. But is he actually a vampire? You might be surprised to know that the character has never been identified as one on Sesame Street itself, but does have some characteristics. He can hypnotize people, is shown to cast no reflection, and apparently hates garlic. According to the Muppet Wiki in 1980, there was a script in which he referred to his youth as being a little vampire, but the line doesn't show up in the actual episode. He shows up in the sun and never drinks blood, of course. I mean, it's a kid's show. What lesson would that teach? Like today's episode is brought to you by the letter O positive? I don't know. So in 2009, on the Sesame Street website, they did call him a number-friendly vampire and suggests that he's related to Dracula himself. And in the book Sesame Street Unpaved, he's again called a numerical vampire. So there are materials out there stating it as fact. However, other bits, like the Sesame Street Muppets Drawing Guide, explicitly states that he isn't a vampire. And in the live show Trick or Treat with Sesame Street, when someone asks if he's dressed as a vampire, his response is,
"A vampire? Where?"
Love the look.
The most definitive answer came in 2017 in a video for Wired magazine, in which a viewer asked if he was a vampire, and his response was,
"Yes, but I am a vampire with an unquenchable thirst for numbers."
So that would be a pretty clear direction that he is actually a vampire. But what's up with the counting? That's weird, right? Well, no it's not, because there's an actual element of folklore that this stems from. According to legend, if you spill a bag of rice, grain, seeds, or something similar, they will be compelled to count every grain. The goal was to place the seed at the gravesite of someone that you think will rise as the undead, but when they get out, they would see them and be forced to count every single one. This hasn't been used much in popular culture outside of an X-Files episode, and Chinese hopping vampire movies like Mr. Vampire, so even though this is an established thing in lore, the creator of the Count has outright stated that he was unaware of this, and his name was just a joke about being the Count and counting. So it's just a great coincidence, and now I'm sorry that I spent so much time talking about a puppet vampire. Back to our regularly scheduled program. 11 questions.
Here's an interesting question with an obvious answer, but with some additional background, and that's what was the very first movie with a vampire.
So the easy answer is 1922's Nosferatu. It's generally considered to be the first vampire movie, and that's mostly correct. But let's look at a few other details. Before 22, there actually were several movies with characters referred to as vampires. One of these is 1913's The Vampire. It seems like that should be the first vampire film, right? Well, it looks like the characters here are actually vamps, not vampires, and were human femme fatales. women who would use their feminine wiles to seduce men into deadly situations. A similar situation occurred 2 years later in 1915's A Fool Was There, again focused on a vamp and not a vampire. But now, here's the tricky part. There's a film from 1921 called Dracula's Death from Hungary, and could possibly consider to take the spot. It's a bit tough to weigh out because the film has been lost to time and no copies of it exist, so there's only records of its existence and plot, but it's not like you can just go watch it to make up your mind about it. But here's what it's apparently about. A young woman is admitted into an insane asylum suffering from visions, and one of the other inmates claims to be Count Dracula himself. His appearance is very vamp-like, and his hauntings of her are very indicative of what the genre would soon become, although it seems as if his vampire status is up in the air, whether it's real or just her dreams and visions. Because of this, and the mystery of his identity, most don't actually consider it to be an appearance of Dracula and an adaptation of the character, making Nosferatu the definitive first film with an analog of the Count. 12 questions.
Speaking of Nosferatu, is it true that they used an actual vampire for the filming?
So this urban legend was once so pervasive that they made an entire movie out of it. Shadow of the Vampire was actually based on the real-life urban legend that Max Schreck, the actor that played Count Orlok, was actually a real member of the undead that they hired to be in the movie. This story spread because there's actually very little information about Schreck's life outside of his acting, and his colleagues all referred to him as a quiet loner with a dark sense of humor. There's speculation that his name was simply a pseudonym, considering that the German translation for Schreck is actually terror, although when I read it through Google Translate it says scared, and that's close enough. There was also what seemed to be a conscious effort by the filmmakers to keep Schreck out of the public eye, seemingly hiding him, but again, that's just speculation. Most of the theory is just due to the performance, and word that his acting was so fluid, so simple, as if that level of creepiness was just built into his being. But that's a little demeaning to Schreck's acting ability. It's like saying that someone can't be that good at what they do, so they must just be a vampire. When I was younger, one of the first times I heard about this legend was being told that the dissolve at the end, which kills the Count, was an effect that shouldn't have been possible for this time period, but that was just false, and dissolves like that had been done earlier. So, yeah, ultimately not a real thing, but an interesting story nonetheless. 13 questions. After
Nosferatu came Dracula, and spooky header Sylvia wants to know, what's up with those armadillos?
In the 1931 Dracula, as Renfield arrives at Castle Dracula, there's a quick shot of a couple of armadillos just kind of wandering around. They're not the only odd animals around, since there's also some possum and a really big bee. But why armadillo? They're not really a common animal or anything, so what the hell are they doing there? Is there some sort of link between vampires and armadillos? Seemingly so, because they also reside in Dracula's castle in Monster Squad, although that was just a nod to this, really. Well, there's tons of thoughts on this matter, including the olden belief that armies had been seen digging in graveyards, so people thought that they were trying to get into the coffins to eat the corpses there. But the scene takes place in Transylvania, which is in Europe, and armadillos are a South American animal, so they'd have to be transported there. Possum are also native to the Americas and aren't found in Europe, but the possum in this film is an actor playing a rat, because old films didn't show rats, because audiences were turned off by them. My personal favorite theory is that since the vampires have to sleep amongst the dirt of their native land, the Count would have them brought over, since they feed on the small insects that would dig into the dirt and actually eat away at the corpses. They were kind of his pest control solution. From a behind-the-scenes perspective, it's thought that Todd Browning, the film's director, believed that audiences were unfamiliar with the animals and placed them in there for crate factor, but that's mainly speculation. The third theory brings in elements brought up in Nosferatu, actually, and that's that the vampires bring them with plague. In that movie, along with Count Orlok, the town was beset upon by a great disease, and there's a bit of it in Dracula as well. So the theory goes like this. Armadillos are the only creature besides humans to carry leprosy, so they were there in order to spread weakness and plague. But wait a minute, okay, I've talked about the armadillos, but can we go back to that bug? It's not a bee, actually, it's a Jerusalem cricket, which first of all is from western US and Mexico, but is this a giant bug? Or a regular-sized bug in a tiny coffin? Is this one of Dracula's brides? I mean, besides bats and wolves, can vampires turn into big crickets now? Did Dracula really just dig this one little bug so he turned him into a vamp sack and then gave him his own matchbook-sized coffin to sleep the sleep of the damned? Or is this a regular-sized coffin, and there's just this human-sized cricket wandering around this movie that no one seems to care about? I want to see a movie about the Transylvanian giant Jerusalem cricket, damn it. I don't think it's too much to ask for.
So there you have it, 13 questions about vampires and vampires in movies that I think we've got some pretty solid answers for. Now, there's a ton of information out there about vampires and lore and backstories, and I'm sure that I missed quite a bit. So we're just interpreting a portion of it. There's been so many interpretations of these things that it's impossible to list them all. So maybe we'll do a follow-up on this in the future and cover a little bit more of that, maybe dig a little bit deeper into this subject. But I hope you enjoyed them. If you like the answers to these questions down below, if you can identify all of the movies I used, let me know that down below there as well too. And as always, please like this video and share it out there. Subscribe to the channel, click that little bell so you get these subscriptions, and check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines and help support this channel like these guys do to help keep these vampire movies going and maybe upgrade my vampire teeth so I can talk properly while I'm wearing them. It's not very comfortable. But anyway, I'll see you guys very shortly for another great video in November. Bye, guys.